Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center Designing for Pedestrian Safety webinar series. Today is the 6th webinar of this 8-part series. Today's webinar is entitled Interchanges and Roundabouts with Fred Ranck, Federal Highway Administration Resource Center Safety Design Engineer, presenting on interchanges, and we have Hillary Isebrands, Federal Highway Administration Resource Center Safety Specialist, presenting on roundabouts. My name is David Anderson, and I am the PBIC Communications Coordinator. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'd first like to say hello to our speakers to make sure they are ready and everyone can hear them. Fred, are you there?
Fred's here, and I'm happy to be here today.
All right, and Hillary, do we have you on the line as well?
Sure do, Davian. Thank you.
Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear Fred and Hillary, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hand so that we can be sure our audience can hear us. Okay, great. It looks like hands are being raised so everyone can hear us. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You'll be able to rejoin the session. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, so by muting your audio, it helps us to cut down on confusion and background noise. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrow. Though you won't be able to speak, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them into the question box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here. I'll monitor these questions and respond to you if I'm able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program, when we have built in about 20 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Also, when you exit the webinar, there is a very brief survey that will pop up. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance. Following today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will be sent 1 to 2 days after the presentation and will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to the other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their name. Before we get started with today's program, I want to give everyone a little information about this webinar series. The goal of the Designing for Pedestrian Safety webinar series is intended to help communities address pedestrian safety issues through design and engineering solutions. Modeled after the Federal Highway Administration and PBIC's in-person training course, Designing for Pedestrian Safety, this free webinar series will cover topics ranging from sidewalk design to road diets. The next webinar in the Designing for Pedestrian Safety series has not been scheduled. Once this webinar has been scheduled, we will send out an announcement via the PBIC email list, and we will also post it to the PBIC website. The 8-part series was developed by the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, a national clearinghouse of pedestrian and bicycle-related safety information and resources. We offer information and technical assistance to diverse audiences about health and safety, engineering, advocacy, education, enforcement, access, and mobility as it relates to pedestrians and bicyclists. The PBIC and today's webinar are both made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation Federal Highway Administration. Today's session will also be archived and available for download on our website at www.walkinginfo.org/webinars. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at walkinginfo.org/training. Now I'm going to turn the screen over to Fred Ranck for the feature presentation, Interchanges and Roundabouts. While he's getting set up with his slide presentation, I do want to take a quick poll from the audience. Please let us know how many participants are viewing the webinar at your site. Okay, it looks like the majority of our participants have voted. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll now. Thank you. Now we will have our speakers tell us a little bit about their background. Fred, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself?
Certainly, David. By the way, thank you for hosting today. This is a great opportunity. I'm Fred Ranck, a safety engineer for the Federal Highway Administration. I'm quartered in the FHWA's Resource Center, part of the Office of Technical Services for of FHWA, along with the National Highway Institute. The role of the Resource Center is to deploy the best and the latest best practices in the form of highway and transportation engineering technology so that the federal dollars and local dollars that are invested in transportation infrastructure work for everybody in the best possible way. I'm a long-time county and city engineer involved in projects. In the 1980s, I headed up the Highway Traffic Safety Department of the National Safety Council and was one of the developers of the National Walk Alert Pedestrian Safety Program. I was also one of the authors of the ITE practice on best practice of the Institute on design of transportation facilities. I continue to be involved in pedestrian matters to advance the technology that works best for pedestrians as a mode, an integral mode of our society today. David, if you'd be so kind, why don't you share the screen on my PC and we'll get started.
Okay, we will take questions at the end. Fred, you can take it from here.
Okay, when you say take it from here, I'm going to click on show my screen and let's hope this works. Davey and Hillary, tell me if you can see the first slide on interchanges.
Yes, we're good to go.
All righty, thank you. There are a couple of areas of greatest difficulty for pedestrians as a mode in transportation. Hillary's in a session that covers this. Hillary Isebrands is going to cover the issues with pedestrians and designing for them for roundabouts. In this first of the two sessions today, I'm going to cover what the best practices are, the issues for interchanges. From my point of view, I have always been very concerned about pedestrians and crossing interchange ramps, particularly free flow on-ramps, as well as exit ramps of interchanges. I think it's the most perilous, hazardous situation that we can put a pedestrian in, yet it doesn't receive the attention that so many other areas of related to pedestrian safety and mobility are involved in. With that, let's get started. By the end of this short session, you will be able to identify how land uses near freeway interchanges create pedestrian trips, and pedestrians are an inherent part to be expected of users to be accommodated, and all their forms as pedestrians near interchanges. The value of land near interchanges, even though it may have been developed as a rural interchange originally, rises significantly because of the proximity to the access to freeways. Hence, intense higher uses of land than agricultural or rural come about. They come about either in a planned or unplanned manner, but they create, as a result, pedestrian walking trips near, across, crossing the freeway on the conventional roadway at the interchange that put pedestrians in particular issues that we need to be sensitive to, we need to include specifically into our design. We'll also explain how and why pedestrian crashes occur at these interchanges. Drivers typically aren't expecting pedestrians. They're looking for other vehicles. They've come out of a high-speed, free-flow movement on the freeway itself. And all of a sudden, there, at the end of the ramp, may be a pedestrian crossing in a crosswalk. This is not a low driver demand situation. It's a high workload environment situation, and one that many drivers don't wake up to realize that what's going on and how quickly it's unfolding in front of them. The last of the three bullets of the issues and specifics in this module that we'll cover is the best practice to create, specifically by design, a speed context within which the pedestrian movement can be done safely, securely, without hazard. And that's the lower speed or slow speed environment. It is done by making compact, short distance crossings with radiuses that are smaller, consistent with lower speed design. Land use, vehicles, and pedestrians. Interchanges always end up with large commercial tracks because they're close to the freeway. Quick and easy and expedient access. So we have trips that use the freeway, exit and enter to get to high-value commercial sites. We have employees at these sites, so many of them are of the service variety, retailers, restaurants, not just service stations, hotels, for which the service people, walking is their only mode. We have a lot of visitors and users of these service locations near interchanges. They need a way to get to and from the things that they're doing. And we have and specifically the pedestrians have to be able to cope in a safe, workable environment, the vehicles that coming off the ramps and entering the ramps to the freeway. Land use today has evolved significantly since World War II. We do not have the compact urban centers that we once had at the time of World War I and before. Typically, along a freeway, a typical city has just a few freeway interchanges. And the freeway itself becomes a barrier to pedestrian movements. We have some crossings that are not interchanges. These are preferable from a pedestrian's point of view because they don't have the ramps. We have non-interchange crossings that are easier for pedestrians. It's the interchanges that have the conflicts. When you look at an interchange, to accommodate all the pedestrian movements, we're doing them along parallel to on the conventional roadway, the cross street, where the ramps intersect from the freeway. And that's from left to right in the illustration, the diagram, the figure that's in front of you. Unfortunately, these pedestrian movements along either the upper or the lower sides of our east-west arterial from left to right have to cross the on and off ramps. And sometimes, and not all that uncommon, we need to be able to get pedestrians across the arterial near the freeway ramps. And usually there's added turning lanes, either exiting decel lanes or acel lanes that add further width, make it more difficult in terms of the distance crossed for a pedestrian. The interior crosswalks at an interchange, those that are between the ramps on the conventional roadway, typically are closed. The crosswalks that are on the outside of these ramp intersections typically are the ones that need to be open. And yet, even with islands and other good measures in tight radii, this is not a favorable, conducive, walkable environment. This is one that's got a higher level of difficulty to it for a pedestrian. Typical interchanges can be big with large turning radiuses. The key, the best practice to accommodate pedestrians is to bring the speed environment of the turning movements at these ramp termini with the conventional roadway down to a pedestrian level, a context that we'll characterize as lower speed. And one of the outcomes of that is the interchange then becomes to look like an intersection. And it's an intersection where drivers would expect pedestrians at a busy intersection like in the photo that you have in this slide. Radii are kept reasonably small to restrict the speed of turning traffic and hence make it workable for pedestrians. Consider each of the ramp terminus as half of an urban intersection and plan and design it within that context. In the illustration we have in this slide, there is a right turn pork chop island that's in the upper right-hand quadrant of this intersection of the ramp termini with the conventional roadway, and we use it to break up the crossing distances, in particular for the on-movement right turn lane between the island and the left turn on the ramp, and shorten up the total crossing distance across the arterial street. Islands are the engineer's best tool for busy intersections with lots of lanes to reduce the crossing distance exposure for a pedestrian, to greatly reduce the time they're in the street and the distance. What you wish to avoid are the large radii, such as the intersection to the right, and this is a real-world photo from North Carolina, of an intersection on the right that was developed as a rural interchange with a high-speed sweeping right turn lane. Avoid a free flow movement. How do pedestrians get across it, as shown with the purple arrow here? It's a context that's high speed. A large radius means high speed, and this is not a context that we want to be able to cross pedestrians in. The best practice is a tight radius, restrict speeds, keep them to a slow environment, and facilitate the movements of the pedestrians. The older ramp alignment is shown in yellow, and you can see how the new ramp alignment, which is tighter, has been brought in, and you can see where the sidewalk is turned in this photo from Oregon to the crosswalk. Why was this done? To facilitate in an appropriate manner within the appropriate context to achieve a pedestrian-friendly environment, one that works for them even though it involves high-speed exiting traffic from the freeway. The yellow line is where the old crosswalk was, and look at the length of that. The short new crosswalk is shown by the green arrows, and that is a significantly smaller distance, less exposure in the street, and the speeds as they turning traffic exiting the ramp be much smaller. Where free flow ramps are used, that's the least desirable, crosswalks should be placed where they're visible. The existing crosswalk had been up on the ramp itself, where it's very hard for an approaching driver on the crossroad to see. The crosswalk could be here, as shown with the yellow arrow, and that location is better seen by the approaching driver, and being seen as a pedestrian is very important. Barrier, particularly the raised Jersey barrier, and particularly is a problem with the single-point urban interchanges, can obscure the crosswalk. Be very careful of sight lines and what a driver can see and where. This is a check that should be done in terms of the availability of sight of the crosswalk for each urban interchange. Choosing the best crosswalk location sometimes is not clear, and you need to make it what's most logical to the driver or to the pedestrian. You have three choices: the most direct route, and that's usually on the direct accessible path; the shortest crosswalk, which tends rarely physically to be the most direct route; and then there's the compromise somewhere in between to attain visibility of the pedestrian in the crosswalk and still be not the shortest, but at least shorter than the one that would be on the most direct route. The most direct route always ends up with a longer crosswalk. Unfortunately, the driver can make a turn like this at high speed, and the pedestrian's out in the crosswalk area for a long time and distance with his back turned to traffic. If you shorten up the crosswalk so it's straight across, the driver cannot see the pedestrian in the crosswalk and the sight line on the approach, and they turn onto the ramp and accelerate, and there's the pedestrian confronting them. Even though this is the shortest crosswalk, it's not the best. Somewhere in between, a Midway Solution appears to be the best. It is a design that is being used by many agencies today as the best answer with the best results. So where to place a crosswalk? Even though in the photo on the left, we've identified the most direct route, but it's a long crosswalk opening across the ramp, the shortest is up ahead past the yield signs. In fact, the photo on the right is where the older gentleman with his back to us in the photo on the right is walking to get across the shortest. So Midway could be used by both a younger person or an older person as a choice. And Midway in between seems to work the best. And that is what we, FHWA, are recommending as the best practice. And it's given the best results in the field. The single-point urban interchange, or SPUI, presents several problems, particularly the SPUI that's under, and this is a photo of a freeway going over a single point that goes under below. When you look at all of the locations where a pedestrian has to cross, there's many, and that's the problem. We know that a single point takes less right-of-way than a split diamond or a tight diamond. Also, and as a result, is always seen as advantageous in terms of cost of land. Also, with a SPUI, we only have 3 phases that we need for the signal control. We have 3 movements. They're all run through one cabinet, one controller, one set of signals. We first have the through movements on the crossroad. Then we have the left turns in one direction. Then we have the left turns in the other direction. Left, with having only 3 phases as opposed to a tight diamond with 6 phases, we have less yellow and red time, less lost time as it's spoken, and more efficiency. We have longer clearance distances with a single point, and we have a lot of now ramps. In fact, each of the crosswalks that go from left to right have to cross 1, 2, 3, 4 on and off ramps in total in order to continue along their path along the arterial. So how to make a SPUI work for pedestrians? Provide continuous sidewalks on both sides. Break up the crossing into several small steps, and it's done naturally in a SPUI design with the geometrics to provide the large turning islands. These are not small. We want to, with these islands, still keep a tight, essentially right angle turning movements. Make it clear to drivers where to expect pedestrians by where we place the crosswalk in clear visibility of the driver approaching the on or the on-ramp. So 1, our pedestrian walks along a well-defined right turn lane, crosses at point 2 to the island, crosses the on-ramp. 3, peds proceed across the island, along the sidewalk on the island. 4, then we cross the other on-ramp from the left turn, and that's signal controlled. Then our ped proceeds on the sidewalk under or over the bridge to the next set of ramps for the other side of the freeway, and cross the exit lane, signal controlled typically with a SPUI, cross the island, and then 8 across the last of the exit ramps, typically is yield controlled. So we've broken up this sequential movement into 8 separate movements with appropriate pedestrian facilities and control for each of them. So aerial view looks like this. Our pedestrians are walking from left to right. They've come up from the left on the south side of our conventional roadway for this SPUI that's under, crossed the on-ramp from the right turn lane to the island, and now cross to under the freeway, cross the off-ramp, signal controlled, then cross the second island and the yield controlled or stop controlled right turn lane, and on along the sidewalk. With most SPUIs, there's never a phase where pedestrians can cross the urban arterial itself within the SPUI intersection. And you need to understand that if for some reason you do need to provide pedestrian crosswalks, they can be done, but you're going to have to accommodate it in the signal cycle and in the sequence. The problem is vehicle phase 1's at odds or conflicts with these pedestrian movements across the arterial at the SPUI. So does vehicle phase 2 of the 3 phases, and also vehicle phase 3. Solution number 1 is to do a 2-step crossing, and that's where you would cross from the island to a refuge island in the middle, where they divide the 2 opposing directions of traffic, or cross the pedestrians nearby but not at the SPUI, at the adjacent signals or at a signalized pedestrian crossing away from the SPUI. So let's recap. Why is controlling land use important? Just why do pedestrian crashes occur at freeway interchanges, and what kind of movements should be avoided? And how can one mitigate for these problems? Well, land use is important because you have high cost, high density, high commercial value land. And those types of land uses generate pedestrian traffic. It's expected, it's a natural outcome, and you need to plan for it and make sure it works. Many of the employees, particularly of service sites such as large auto dealers, hotels, restaurants, walking is part of their transportation trip along with other forms of transit, and it may not be by auto at all. So provision of pedestrian facilities is crucial to get these people to work and from work safely using their mode, which is public transportation and walking. The issue with pedestrian safety at interchanges is that drivers don't expect them. Drivers are exiting or entering the freeway, which is a high-speed environment, and they just don't expect pedestrians in the high-speed environment. So what kind of movement should be avoided? Free-flow movements on the ramps, anything with high speed. We need to be with geometry. The best geometric design techniques keep turning lane geometry tight and stay in a low-speed context so we can provide for pedestrians. And we mitigate them with the measures I just covered. So attractors create pedestrian demand. Drivers' expectations of pedestrians is low at ramp termini, and they're going very fast, exiting and entering the freeway. Avoid the high-speed, free-flow turning movements. Reconstruction or initial construction of tighter radii will create a low-speed context appropriate for providing for pedestrians. So how can one mitigate? With low speed, right-angle urban design, improved crosswalk placement. These techniques are proven. These techniques work, and FHWA is promoting these, pushing these down as the best practice to meet the pedestrians in the environment of freeway interchanges. So in our learning outcomes, you should be able now to identify and understand how the higher type developed land uses around a freeway interchange create pedestrian trips, and if we have pedestrians, we need to provide for them. Explain how and why pedestrian crashes occur at interchanges. Well, it's a high speed. Did I mention high speed? It's a high speed and often a free flow context, and it's one where drivers are not looking for pedestrians as they would at a urban, tight, compact intersection in a higher density area. The best solution is to stay within the pedestrian context of low speed, tight turning radii in the geometrics. So at this point, Davian, if you're still there, would you please switch over out of interchanges and go to roundabouts? And I'll introduce my good friend Hillary Isebrands, and she's going to talk about pedestrians and their issues at roundabouts. And thanks.
Okay, and we'll now hear from Hillary. And Hillary, do you mind telling everyone a little bit about yourself before you get started?
Certainly, Davian. And just so we get started off on the right foot here, can everyone hear me all right, Davian, Fred?
Yes, it looks like the presentation is there and everyone can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Okay. Thanks, Fred. And we're going to transition into talking a little bit about pedestrians and how they do work for, roundabouts and how they do work for pedestrians. But first off, my name is Hillary Isebrands. I am also with the Federal Highway Administration Resource Center. I am located out of the Lakewood, Colorado office of the Resource Center. I am recently new to Federal Highway Administration. Prior to that, I was in consulting. I did highway design. I was a highway engineer in the state of Wisconsin for several years. And from there, I went to Iowa State University. And Iowa State University is where I got extremely involved with pedestrian traffic and safety research with the Iowa DOT. Spent some time doing studies at K-12 schools, looking at traffic and safety issues at schools. And for those of us that have seen arrival times and dismissal times at schools, you know exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about pedestrian safety and some of our vulnerable users with our young kids. And I also spent some time doing some studies dealing with large events, large traffic events that also are large pedestrian generators. For example, football games, concerts, and how the interaction between pedestrians and motor vehicles and how they sometimes get along and sometimes how it can be a pretty unsafe environment. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and spend some time talking to you about roundabouts. Roundabouts is an area also for the past 7 years that I have done quite a bit of research on, and hopefully you'll find this information useful. Roundabouts are new and exciting. Some states are much farther ahead than others when it comes to roundabouts, but a common concern that we hear all over the U.S. is how do they work for pedestrians, and how can we make sure that pedestrians are just as safe at roundabouts as we're finding that motor vehicles are. So with that, the learning objectives of this portion of the webinar today is we're going to look at explaining why roundabouts reduce crashes and describing their safety benefits for pedestrians as well as motor vehicles, and then describe how the safety does depend on good design and good geometrics. Always important to have a good design on the ground, and then that's promoting the best safety for motor vehicles as well as for pedestrians and bicyclists. So quickly, just going to talk a little bit about what a modern roundabout is. It is a circular intersection. There are other circular intersections that you might be familiar with, large rotaries. Also neighborhood traffic calming circles, that might be something that you may be familiar with. But these are all circular intersections. But what's important to understand is that not all circular intersections are roundabouts. Roundabouts do have their own specific design characteristics, and we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about that. But first off, we're going to look at what are some of these features of a modern roundabout that make it special and not a traffic circle and not a neighborhood traffic calming circle. So there's the separated sidewalks direct to the peds. Pedestrians do not cross to the center island. There's a splitter island that acts as a refuge as pedestrians cross one direction of traffic at a time. Typically, the pedestrian crosswalk is approximately 1 car length back from the yield line, and also the deflection of the entry, as well as the curvature of the roundabout itself, exhibits and really forces traffic to be traveling anywhere probably from 15 to 20 miles an hour. So you've got slow speeds on all of your approaches. All of your traffic is going on at a fairly uniform speed, which is a safety benefit to everyone, all users of the roadway and intersection. So that gives you an idea of what, again, some of the features of a modern roundabout, but let's quickly go back and talk about what you may be more familiar with, which might be the New England-style rotary, where we typically have a large diameter, and these large diameters can create high speeds. So a modern roundabout is not a New England-style rotary. Here's an example of, you see the large diameter. This was an old rotary, over 600 feet. There's no control on the entry, so the vehicles approaching the intersection are not yielding to the people that are driving in the circulating roadway. And so there's high speeds and weaving areas. So that's typically what you would find with a large rotary. Now, in comparison, look at the difference between a modern roundabout, which in this case we were saying typically 120 to 250 feet. They can be larger, they can be smaller, but look at the huge difference between what the old style rotaries look like and what that new modern roundabout looks like. It's quite substantial, and you can see that the design exhibits slower speeds for the motorist. You also you can see there is a bypass lane that was created for this particular roundabout that's fairly unique, I guess, to this particular case based on traffic volumes. But again, you can see the curvature of the approach, the deflection that would constitute slower speeds. Again, a roundabout is not what we find in Washington, D.C. The old circles, many of those circles in Washington, D.C. area have actually the green, yellow, red traffic signals that do control the vehicles coming in and out of the circle. You can also see that there's access to the center island. Again, not a characteristic of a modern roundabout, but what you would find at these DC, and I say DC just as an example, but the DC-style circles. Also, it's not a traffic calming circle. This is one that you often find in neighborhoods, particularly done, again, to slow traffic down. They are constructed within the right-of-way, and again, it's not to be confused with mini roundabouts that do have the features and characteristics of the modern roundabout. In this case, there is no deflection on the approaches, and oftentimes you would find a stop sign at one or more of the approaches on a neighborhood traffic calming circle. So similar in nature, but again, not what we would constitute as a modern roundabout. And lastly, it's certainly not, we joke and we see the pictures and you think of European vacation with Chevy Chase and his family, how he can't get out of the traffic circle. And again, this is not a modern roundabout, but this might be something that you might be more familiar with than the modern roundabout itself. And you can see there's a poor pedestrian in the middle of that circle there trying to get across to the center island. So not what we're talking about here, but again, wanted to get some of that on the table as far as what a modern roundabout is not. When we talk about vehicle-pedestrian conflicts at intersections, you can see here a comparison between a typical four-legged T-style intersection compared to the modern roundabout. And the reduction in the number of conflict points, and these are vehicle-pedestrian conflict points, and how it is reduced to half of the conflicts at a modern roundabout. Now, as you know, I'm not showing the vehicle conflict points here, but the vehicle conflict points is actually 32 at a typical T intersection, similarly to what we show on the left. So the roundabout really does decrease the conflict points for both the pedestrians and vehicles at an intersection, which has significant benefits, again, for all users. Why roundabouts are safer, and I've alluded to this previously, but let's talk a little bit more detail. Slow speeds for all traffic. It's a key element to the safety benefits of a modern roundabout. Reduce conflicts. As we just saw, the number of conflict points is reduced. In addition, the conflict points are changed. You've got different types of conflicts. At a roundabout, we don't see T-bone crashes anymore. So we're changing the characteristics and the types of crashes that might be occurring at an intersection when a roundabout is in place compared to a stop-controlled or a signalized intersection. And again, I mentioned another of the characteristics was the yield on entry. All vehicles approaching that circular roadway are yielding to the traffic within the circulatory roadway. Of course, if there's not a vehicle within the circulatory roadway, they can proceed through the intersection and take an acceptable gap if there is a vehicle in the roadway. Looking at crash reduction factors, 54%, we find typically in the U.S., the studies that have been done, there's NCHRP report 572, which is the most comprehensive study that we have here in the U.S. regarding roundabouts. It saw the benefits of about 54% reduction in total crashes, 76% reduction in fatal and serious injury crashes, and it did find a 27% reduction in pedestrian crashes. Now, most of that research that has been done thus far in the U.S. is looking at primarily single-lane roundabouts, and it is unknown at this time if multi-lane roundabouts produce those high of rates. However, again, going back to why roundabouts are safer, looking at the slower speeds, the reduced conflict points, yield on entry, and some other pedestrian characteristics that we're going to look at in just a minute, you can see that we do feel that there are great benefits for roundabouts for pedestrians, whether it's a single-lane roundabout or a multi-lane roundabout. But it's hard to put numbers as far as a crash reduction factor to this point, specifically with multi-lane roundabouts. So pedestrian movements at a roundabout, again, pretty straightforward. The person crossing here from the right of the screen to the left of the screen would look for traffic coming towards that individual. When he sees an acceptable gap, he crosses to the splitter island. Again, you're only crossing one direction at a time. The crossing distance is shorter. The pedestrian might find refuge within that center island, or excuse me, within the splitter island, before then finding an acceptable gap to cross the exit side of that approach. Advantages for pedestrians, they're crossing only one direction at a time, which again is critical as far as choosing a gap and not looking both directions at the same time, as we sometimes have to at other types of controlled intersections, signals, and stop controlled. Splitter island, again, provides refuge, shortens the travel distance, and then reduced vehicle speeds. Again, I'm repeating this because it's so critical. These are the elements that really provide a safe environment for pedestrians at roundabouts. And the photos that you see in this particular slide, we do find roundabouts very commonly near schools, near school campuses, all over the U.S. There are probably upwards of probably 50 to 100 roundabouts, I would say, near or at schools or intersections adjacent to schools. And then the two photos on the right, I just want to point out this is actually an example of a road diet that included a roundabout at one of the intersections. You can see the number of crossings there. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's about 6 lanes of crossing at that intersection before. This is Asheville, North Carolina. They didn't need all those lanes for capacity. Using their turning movements and the traffic volumes that they had, they were able to narrow up, give that corridor a road diet, and they created a much safer environment. They were able to add bike lanes on that corridor. They were able to add additionally some landscaping features. And again, look at the difference in crossing, the before, if you were a pedestrian crossing that intersection, and the after, and the huge change in the environment you've created for that pedestrian by changing that design on that particular corridor. All right, so let's just step through a few slides on the crossings at a roundabout again. Narrow entries, slow drivers. That's something that is, again, beneficial. Not only does the narrow entry here, in this case for a roundabout, but also the geometric, the design. The design is changing how the driver drives through that intersection. And again, all drivers are typically driving very similar speeds, which is a big advantage. A person's, again, crossing the entry lane here. The person looked, the driver stopped. The person crossed the street to the splitter island. And then again, you can see this particular person's coming across an exit. The person is yielding to the pedestrian. The person here is coming out of the roundabout and driving out. But the pedestrian took the gap and crossed safely. When we talk about multi-lane roundabouts, again, I mentioned our data that we have as far as the safety is a little bit less robust at this point in time, partly because the data that was collected, there weren't a whole lot of multi-lane roundabouts on the ground. But again, reiterating the characteristics of a roundabout, you can see that it does create a safe environment. But we do have to be cognizant of the multiple threat, potential 2 vehicles coming at a 2-lane exit, and one vehicle might be blocking the vision of the pedestrian crossing. So again, with additional conflicts with additional lanes and potential higher speeds at multi-lane roundabouts. And when I say higher speeds, we're talking about 5 miles per hour. higher, so we might be talking 20 to 25 miles an hour instead of the 15 to 20 miles an hour for a single-lane roundabout. But again, that's in that lower threshold for speeds of vehicles versus at a stop-controlled or a signalized intersection, we might have one direction of traffic going 35, 40, 45 miles an hour. And the chances of a fatality if a vehicle hits a pedestrian at those speeds is exponentially higher than at the lower speed range of 15 to 20 miles per hour. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. However, I did want to point out, I mentioned the NCHRP 572 report that's applying roundabouts in the United States, that study, and there is, again, some data within this report that I encourage you all to check out. It looks at pedestrian crossing behaviors when a vehicle was present and the behavior of the pedestrian. It also looks at the yield behavior of the vehicles. So again, this can provide you some information on what's out there as far as the U.S. and the data. And again, I'll leave that to you to dig a little deeper with NCHRP 572 and the findings of that particular study. A lot of you might be interested in how roundabouts, what kind of an environment roundabouts create for sight-impaired pedestrians. And circulating traffic potentially can mask the sound of entering and exiting vehicles, and quiet cars can also increase the ambiguity and uncertainty for that pedestrian that's trying to cross. Also, it's potentially increasing time for non-visual gap selection, again, keeping in mind someone's either blind or sight impaired. So increasing time for non-visual gap selection and confirmation can limit opportunities to cross. So you can imagine the folks that are sight impaired and blind, how they might tackle crossing the street without those visual cues that many of us can rely on. And I will also point out that the U.S. Access Board does have the PROAG, the proposed right-of-way accessibility guidelines, and those are in draft form still at this point. But just many of you are probably curious, and I can get into more details if folks have questions later, but they are proposing that at roundabouts with multi-lane crossings, a pedestrian-activated signal shall be provided at each multi-lane segment of a roundabout. So if you've got a multi-lane approach, you would need to provide a pedestrian-activated signal that would comply with the 306, which is looking at accessible pedestrian signals. And again, if people have questions, I can try to answer some of those a little bit later, but I do encourage you to check that out as well on the U.S. Access Board website if you're interested in that component. As far as lighting goes, many of you may have been on some of the other webinars that we've conducted regarding the pedestrian safety that's been offered through PBIC, and I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the lighting design and how that affects the calling attention to the drivers, calling attention to the crosswalks at roundabouts. And this isn't specifically, this example is roundabouts, but again, as we know, it's very important to have lighting over crosswalks at any intersection or at any crossing. This gives an example of a center-mounted lighting, and you can see there the 400 high-pressure sodium, 28 lux, and what that looks like to the driver, the pedestrian in the crosswalk. And here's another example. Approach-mounted lighting. Again, this is on the approaches on the radius of the roundabout, and you can see the difference in how that person in the crosswalk, when the lighting is provided in a different location, what a difference it can make. And again, here I'm going to go back one so you can see it. There's the 400, the center mounted lighting, 400 high pressure sodium, 28 lux, and then here is the approach mounted lighting. I'm looking at 250 high pressure sodium, 25 lux, and you can just see the difference. So again, the position and the design of your lighting can also make a very big difference in the visibility of the pedestrians in the crosswalks. And again, this is an example for a roundabout, but it also applies at other intersections, and considering the location of the lighting and how important it is. I'm also going to share with you, this was a study, it's NCHRP 3-78A, that has not been published yet, but it was looking at accessibility of pedestrians at multi-lane roundabouts and free right turns as well. And I don't have the exact terminology or the exact title correct for the 378A project, but actually the roundabout that was studied was in Golden, Colorado, and there was two applications, two different types of treatments, I should say, looking at pedestrian accessibility. One was the raised crosswalk, and you can see there the raised crosswalk up ahead at the crosswalk at the multi-lane roundabout. It's a two-lane roundabout. There's another closer look at that raised crosswalk. The other treatment that they studied under this project was the pedestrian hybrid beacon, I guess formerly known as the Hawk. You can see there on the screen. And one more photo of that. That's within the circulating roadway, looking at the exit approach. How might that look? That might look to a driver if a pedestrian was crossing at that particular location. And the results, the preliminary results of this study are pretty promising, and they're also very similar between the pedestrian hybrid beacon as far as yielding and ability of the sight-impaired pedestrians crossing the street. So the pedestrian beacon and the raised crosswalk did give promising results as far as treatments at multi-lane roundabouts. And again, related to this particular study, U.S. Access Board was involved, Federal Highways, and the Transportation Research Board. And so you should be looking for that shortly. But also I want to mention, and I don't have a slide on this, but the rectangular rapid flash beacon is another treatment at crosswalks that has gotten some attention as a potential alternative, again, at a multi-lane roundabout to provide accessibility for pedestrians. And there are two locations in the U.S. right now that have rectangular rapid flash beacon. Again, those are the warning signs that actually, again, they're PED activated and they have a stutter flash on them. Oakland, Michigan is one location where they are installing rectangular rapid flash beacons at multi-lane roundabouts. And then also there is a location in Olympia, Washington. So there are two locations that do have the rectangular rapid flash beacon. It is hopeful that these two locations and more, if they're out there, to be studied and to see what kind of results we get as far as, again, accessibility for pedestrians at multi-lane roundabouts. Here's one other example. This actually is Clearwater, Florida, possible mitigation, and this actually has a pedestrian signal on one of the legs. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this particular location, this is very high volume traffic as well as very, very high volume pedestrian intersection in Clearwater, Florida. And you'll also notice that the signalized pedestrian crossing is set back from the traditional one-car length behind the yield line. And again, it had to do with in this particular case, it was specifically for the operations of where the pedestrians, the origin and destination of the pedestrians, as well as the number of pedestrians. You can see that big wide sidewalk skirting around the roundabout on the what I'll call the south side. Assuming it's north looking up, although I probably don't have the directions quite right. But I think you can get the point here, and here's an example. Again, this was a signal that was put in for pedestrians. And some of you might have traveled overseas in Europe, know that there are signals at roundabouts in, for example, in the United Kingdom. And more often than not, those are put in because the the pedestrian volumes are so high that they need to regulate when pedestrians, basically a pedestrian phase and a vehicle phase at those roundabouts, because otherwise the pedestrians kind of dominate the intersection. So again, just gives you some ideas of treatments at multi-lane roundabouts for handling pedestrians at high volumes as well as providing accessibility for pedestrians. So again, referring back to our learning outcomes, what we were trying to get out of this portion of our webinar today is roundabouts and explain why they reduce crashes. Again, the conflict points have changed, the speeds are lower, you're changing the dynamics of the intersection with the characteristics, the design features and characteristics of the roundabout. And that goes to, with the second bullet there, safety benefits for pedestrians and motor vehicles. For pedestrians, they're crossing one direction of traffic at a time. Traditionally, the crossing is much shorter than what you would find at a stop-controlled and a signalized intersection, particularly if there's right and left turn lanes. And then roundabout safety depends on correct design, of course. Again, the deflection and getting those speeds down into that 15 to 20 mile per hour range, and providing an environment, changing that environment for that driver, and the ability to respect the roadway as well as respect the other road users. So with that, we are going to go to a question and discussion portion of this webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Davian, but keep in mind the questions and discussion are open to not only what I presented here on roundabouts, but also with what Fred presented on interchanges. So with that, Davian?
Thank you, Hillary. Now we have some time for questions. Please enter your questions into the box on your screen. Again, if we run out of time for your question, we will attempt to answer it and get back to you after the program. Okay, it looks like our first question says, European tourists are involved in many Florida pedestrian accidents because they are looking for traffic the wrong way. Are there any programs to help reduce this, and any suggestions?
Okay, David, I'm going to have you read that question again. I didn't catch the first part of it.
Okay, no problem. European tourists are involved in many Florida pedestrian accidents because they are looking for traffic the wrong way. Are there any programs to help reduce this, or any suggestions?
Okay, interesting question. In my travels, actually to the UK, and I'll give England as an example. Outside, about 2 hours north of London, had the opportunity to spend some time with a roundabout expert up there, Barry Crown, and at many of their, and not just roundabouts, but in a lot of locations where they have pedestrian crossings in over there, they actually have on the pavement they have words that say which direction to look. And again, that was just an additional cue to the pedestrian if the vehicles are going in the other direction, and we're traveling on the other side of the road, was a heads up, look this way for traffic. And again, I have not seen anything, and I don't know if in Florida if they have done anything like that, and I can't say that I'm familiar with it. Fred might have some knowledge, but again, most of the I guess what I'm familiar with is over in the UK, and how they actually have basically words and arrows on the sidewalk, and even signs that say, look this direction for traffic. And again, and that would be to the pedestrian that might not be familiar, or that might forget which direction to look. So Fred, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I do. I do wish to add. I'd want to change the question a little and give it some context. Although the question asked was those from other lands look in the wrong direction, the issue with a lot of arterial streets, not just in Florida but throughout the United States, is that the speed context is too high, the radii are too large to create a lower speed conducive context in which pedestrians can walk safely. If the context is right, then even if the pedestrian makes a mistake, there's enough time and space for that mistake not to result in a severe crash involving a pedestrian. If you get the context right to accommodate and provide for pedestrians, bad outcomes don't happen. It's more a context of the street in terms of speed, cross-section, width of lanes, the size of the radius of the turning lanes at intersections than it is which way did the pedestrian look first. Next question.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go ahead and move into the next question. The next question asks, is there any reason not to create a square intersection with significantly reduced turning radii for drivers in order to permit use of a crosswalk, which is both the shortest and most direct route?
Well, I'll answer it. The issue can be what's the size of the design vehicle being accommodated by the turning radiuses. And this is where the role of islands for turning radii is of great help, because islands can consist of raised portions as well as striped out portions, and to provide for the swept out radius of the larger size turning vehicles and still provide the tighter environment for the other smaller vehicles. The key thing in the selection of the appropriate radius and intersection is sometimes not to use the default values in auto turn and the other geometric analysis tools that are available, but to set the appropriate speed for the turning movement consistent with pedestrian, the sought-after pedestrian environment you want to create, and then see if you can accommodate the larger vehicles. Just because you have one moving truck every 2 months does not mean you need to design the entire intersection for turning for the size of that large moving truck. If it's only once every 2 months, he can swing out and come back into the lane, and it would not be an unexpected maneuver.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go ahead and move into the next question. The next question asks, do you know of any efforts to revise the AASHTO Green Book to incorporate best practices for interchange design for pedestrians?
I'm not aware of any activity on the part of the AASHTO Standing Committee on Geometric Design in that regard. I'm not involved with them, so I'm not the best person to respond to that. That's a question that can probably be best addressed by AASHTO itself.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move into the next question. Have you dealt with or have examples of roundabout locations with high pedestrian and or cyclist traffic at peak times whereby the peds and bikes mix on the circulating sidewalk when cyclists have a ramp available for the approaching bike lane to bypass the travel lane?
Okay, I'll take that one. I might have you read it again, Davian, just so I can get it right. But I'm high pedestrian volume as well as bicyclists approaching the roundabout and using the roundabout. There are quite a few locations. As far as high pedestrian volumes, obviously the example that I gave there in Clearwater, Florida, they see large pedestrian volumes. As far as the interaction between bicyclists and pedestrians here in Colorado, for example, in the just off of Interstate 70 in the Vail and Avon, Colorado areas, they do get a lot of very, I guess I would call it touristy area, a lot of pedestrians and bicyclists. And what you find out here is that US 6 actually is one of the roadways that you find a lot of cyclists on, and they are using the roadway. They just enter into the roadway as a vehicle would. In the case in Colorado, there is not provisions for the bicyclist to, there's not a bike ramp to get off and use the sidewalk. They're encouraging folks to actually, on their bikes, to use the roadway as a vehicle. So enter the roundabout as a vehicle would. Now, that being said, we obviously have different, we've got novice bicyclists, we've got children that are riding bikes, and in that case, most definitely if there's a bike lane of sorts, you would want a student or a novice bike rider to use that bike ramp and probably dismount their bike, walk on the sidewalk as a pedestrian would, and cross at that point in time. But there are, with the new federal highways, it's a cooperative effort actually, it's the Federal Highway Administration and the Transportation Research Board, or National Cooperative Highway Research Board, will be publishing the updated roundabout guidelines here at the end of the year. That report and guidelines will be called NCHRP 672. And there is going to be some guidance for bicyclists, more guidance than what you find in the 2000 version of the Roundabout Guide, and I encourage you to check that out. I'm not sure I completely covered that entire question, but there are cases, again, across the U.S. where there are high PED volumes. Again, the Florida cases in Clearwater, Florida, Ken Sides, the city engineer there, he has been very active in roundabouts, and there's a lot of locations. And again, if you offline, if the person who asked the question, if they would like a list of some of those locations, I can certainly get that for them. But again, you can imagine the high pedestrian volumes at certain times for the roundabouts in your schools. And again, the accommodations for bicyclists on the West Coast in particular, we're finding a lot of bike lanes that are going into roundabouts. And again, it's the person on the bike that it would be their option to travel through the roundabout on their bike or use the bike ramp and dismount and cross as a pedestrian.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to our next question. The next question asks, does the success of a roundabout depend on equal volumes, similar volumes, or on all or most approaches?
So this question alludes to, I imagine, balanced flows versus unbalanced flows. And originally, I would say, and even in the 2000 Federal Highways Guide, Roundabouts Guide, there was some question as to if roundabouts can handle the unbalanced flows appropriately. And I would say, from my experience and from my knowledge, that myth has kind of gone by the wayside. There's a lot of locations across the U.S. that are handling roundabouts that are handling unbalanced flows. Again, it's a matter of geometry. Roundabouts are very flexible as far as hybrid lane use, 2 lanes for one particular turning movement, and that might be a single lane, and for another turning movement. So they can be very versatile as far as accommodating traffic volumes and traffic movements and turning movements. And so I can, off the top of my head, there's Eagle, Colorado is an example of very unbalanced flows at a particular location. There's one in Lothian, Maryland, just outside of Annapolis, Maryland. It's very unbalanced flows, and they operate tremendously. And again, those there's not really a pedestrian component to that. But again, it would be a matter of, it's a matter of how it's designed, and but I would say that myth has kind of gone by the wayside here in the U.S. as far as unbalanced flows.
Fred Ranck here. I would say that they're probably in practice, the majority of the roundabouts that have been built and are operating today are in fact handling unbalanced flows. That's probably the more common situation than not. As opposed to the standard cross intersection with or without right turn islands or raised channelization, roundabouts are a far more flexible intersection design. Portions of it can be 1, 2, or 3 circulating lanes. You do not have to provide for that on all throughout the roundabout. You can essentially design to fit the flows a roundabout far better than you can with a standard at-grade cross intersection.
Thank you, Fred and Hillary. Okay, we're going to move on to our next question. The next question asks, could you just talk a little bit more about multi-lane roundabouts? And they go on to further to say, like the ones used in Oakland County, Michigan. And I know you went over this in your presentation, but I guess a little bit more about how they can be seen as ADA unfriendly.
Sure, and I'm actually, I think there's a link to, and I can get this to you, Davian. Hopefully, I might not be able to get to by the end of this webinar, but the U.S. Access Board did a really good webinar not too long ago. It was co-sponsored by the Transportation Research Board and the U.S. Access Board. It was an Easter Seals webinar series that was occurring, and they've got some really great information and guidance regarding roundabouts and accessibility and the proposed rulemaking. And so, for example, at this point in time, again, the proposed rulemaking is out there. as far as their proposed guidance, again, looking at signalizing pedestrian-activated signal complying with as far as accessibility at multi-lane segments of the roundabout. And I encourage you to take a look at that. And as I mentioned, Oakland County is just one example of a location where they actually have 2 roundabouts on the same corridor, and one has the pedestrian hybrid beacon. And then this summer, they were installing the rectangular rapid flash beacons at that particular location. Again, they're studying that. They did a before and after study looking at pedestrians, not only able-bodied pedestrians, but also sight impaired and blind pedestrians. Again, a before and after study for that. And so, but there, as you know, there's multi-lane roundabouts out there that don't have those provisions at this point in time. But at this point, you know, the U.S. Access Board is looking to advance their proposed right-of-way accessibility guidelines here this fall or early next year. And I encourage you to get the details in. And if I might, Davian, I will try to find that web link, and you can provide it to the folks. If not, whoever asked that question, if they want to get in touch with me, I can provide that to you after the webinar today as far as the presentation that was just done. And again, I think it was a really good overview of accessibility, U.S. Access Board's views on that, and roundabouts.
Great, and we can make sure we post that that link in the Q&A when we post it to the website following the webinar.
Thank you, Davian. Okay,
we're going to move into our next question. Why do most roundabouts take the bicycle lane off of the roadway in a roundabout? Why not take them through the roundabout?
I think I probably covered that in a previous question, but again, it's a matter of how the comfort level of the bicyclists. If I had a child in a bike lane going down the road, I would prefer that they didn't enter the traffic like a vehicle, that they would actually take the bike ramp and use the sidewalk like a pedestrian. It's an option, and it's in great part the comfort level of the bike rider as whether they want to enter the traffic lane or exit off and act as a pedestrian. Again, going back to one of the main characteristics of a roundabout, it is a slower speed environment for pedestrians and vehicles and bicyclists. So it's easier for a biker to merge into traffic, I would say, at a roundabout, and then probably a traditional signalized or stop-controlled intersection because they're traveling at speeds more similar to a vehicle at that point in time. So it depends on the bicyclists themselves, but more often than not, provisions for especially if there is a designated bike lane, you've got an exit ramp to the sidewalk. So, depending on you know, what the bicyclist chooses to do.
Okay, thank you. Moving to the next question. Are vehicle drivers required to use their right turn signal when exiting the modern one-lane roundabout?
This is Fred Ranck.
Required? I don't know.
The issue depends on what each state law says for the Uniform Vehicle Code. But the best answer is a yes in every state that I'm aware of, because it's a turn. And when you make a turn, you should put on your turn signal before you make the turn in adherence to what the Uniform Vehicle Code of that state provides for a driver's rules of the road to be obeyed. And that's where I'm going to leave it. That's what the laws of the state typically state. Now, if people do it, that's a whole different thing, and that goes back to how well are the traffic laws in your state enforced.
Okay, thank you, Fred. The next question asks, are there any special considerations when using slip lanes with roundabouts?
Hillary, do you want to try that one?
Okay, I think we may have lost Hillary.
All right, so if we could, please restate the question, and I'll try and answer it.
Okay. The question asks, are there any special considerations when using slip lanes with roundabouts?
Well, I'm not sure what a slip lane at a roundabout is, and I'm not trying to beg off the question. If you mean as a free-flow right turn lane separated by channelization from the roundabout itself, yes, there are. And any free-flow movement poses a problem for a pedestrian trying to cross it, whether it's at a roundabout or at a channelized, signalized intersection or stop-controlled intersection. Less control, less of the pedestrian conducive context. A free-flow right turn lane associated with the roundabout poses a special and higher level of difficulty for any pedestrian trying to cross it.
Okay, and we did lose Hillary. We're going to try to get her back on the line. The next question asks, what advantage would a hawk have over a conventional pedestrian-activated signal at a roundabout?
I'll answer it, Fred Ranck here. The hawk offers a three-section head, red ball, yellow ball, green ball. And they're used in an interesting arrangement in terms of sequence, in that we flash the yellow, then go to solid red, and then go to flashing red to indicate to drivers they may proceed while the pedestrians are clearing. The thing about a hawk is it provides the highest level of security or apparent security that the pedestrian is seeking. It displays a solid red signal to not only stop traffic, but to hold traffic stopped. The problem with flashing red or anything flashing or stop or even yield control is that they stop drivers, but then drivers go after stopping. And this poses some issues for pedestrians. It always has amazed me the amount of difficulty and the discomfort that pedestrians will voice and express about trying to cross a busy four-way, always stop controlled intersection. All vehicles are required to stop. It's a low-speed environment. Yet pedestrians don't view always stop environments as friendly because drivers, after stopping, go. And what pedestrians are seeking most of all is they want to stop and hold traffic until they've completely crossed the roadway. And that's the big difference. Okay. And Hillary, do we have you back on the line?
You do. Sorry about that. I don't, my phone must have timed out or something.
Okay, not a problem at all. We're going to move into the next question. Have RRFs been tested at multi-lane roundabouts?
The rectangular rapid flash beacons have not been studied at multi-lane roundabouts. Rectangular rapid flash beacons have been studied at mid-block crossings, and I believe that as actually Federal Highways did have a study that will be published here shortly, and Fred, well, I'll let Fred speak to that a little bit more. But no, they have not been studied. However, there are some discussions on trying to get a study underway to study rectangular rapid flash beacons as a potential alternative, you know, as far as accessibility, but also just in general at multi-lane crossings at roundabouts. So stay tuned on that one. We are hopeful that that a project will be hopefully initiated in the near future, possibly a cooperative effort with U.S. Access Board and Federal Highway Administration and some of the localities that are and jurisdictions that are out there that do have them in place. Fred, do you want to speak to the crash reduction factors and rectangular rapid flash beacons as they pertain to mid-block crossings?
Sure, be glad to. Although on the face of it, it doesn't seem like it would be all that effective or as effective as some other measures are out there, the stutter flash units, yellow, used with standard pedestrian warning signs, the supplementary signs at the crossing, have been proven in a series of studies, multiple locations, to increase driver yielding behavior, to yield to the pedestrian in the crosswalk, up to between 82 to 88% of the approaching drivers. When you get up to 82, 90%, you're essentially up in the same type of effectiveness as a hawk, signal, which is the pedestrian hybrid beacon, or for that matter, of a traffic signal itself. At these high levels, you've attained what you seek to in influencing driver behavior, drivers to slow and stop in time for each and every pedestrian that would activate the stutter flash, the rapid rectangular, rapid flashing display of these signs. They're working very effectively. Now that there are more and more of them out there in the United States, we're seeing the same good results from something that's remarkably less cost than installing either a hawk or a full traffic signal.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like we have about 5 more minutes for questions. So I'm going to move into the next question. Could you please discuss pedestrian access to other types of common urban interchanges such as jug handles?
David, could you state that question again? I don't think I've heard the term pedestrian and jug handle in the same sentence in 50 years of life as an engineer.
Okay, I'll read that question again. Please discuss pedestrian access to other types of common urban interchanges such as jug handles.
Well, jug handle is not an interchange. It's a type of cross intersection to provide for U-turns or other indirect movements rather than doing an inside left turn lane at a conventional road. Jug handle interchange might be the trumpet interchange, but that's a freeway to freeway and not with a conventional roadway. I'm not sure I understand the question very well.
Okay, and if that attendee wants to resubmit that question, we can see if we can get that answered for you. The next question asks, how do roundabouts affect capacity?
Hillary, I'll jump in. For the most part, roundabouts do great. First of all, you don't need all the storage lanes to store all the traffic that's sitting there waiting for the green while on red. So hence, you don't need the bigger footprint and all those long storage lanes. Until you get up to approaching saturated flow, roundabouts on a lane-by-lane basis compared to signalized intersections have a lot less delay and as great or a capacity. Signalized intersections and roundabouts both suffer the same sad outcome. As you approach and get into saturated flow conditions, nothing good happens. Whether it's signalized or roundabout, it bogs down, delays increase, it no longer functions well, and that's the same sad ending of any intersection with too much traffic for its configuration.
I'll just add to that. As Fred said, roundabouts, again, I don't know if folks have heard of the wide nodes, narrow roads concept, that you can, with roundabouts, you can eliminate the storage lanes for the left turn lanes and right turn lanes, and in a lot of intersections, especially in suburban areas, we have dual lefts. With roundabouts, you really can eliminate a lot of that those additional approach lanes, and so even though at the intersection, in some cases, not all cases, you might need a little additional right of way. Depends on how many lanes you would need in the roundabout itself circulating. You actually are saving on real estate potentially, but then also 24 hours a day, folks. We have to think about the traffic on off-peak hours. We tend to design to, our peak hour, oftentimes a morning peak and a PM peak. And what's so great about a roundabout is that 24 hours a day, it's operating, I'd say, much more efficient than a signalized intersection. And what we also have to think about is what we're willing to live with as far as capacity at our intersections. And, maybe during peak hour it is level of service D, but some agencies, hey, level of service D is okay. And so operationally, there's operational benefits as well as safety benefits. And again, when we're probably leaning a little bit more towards vehicles here, but for pedestrians as well. If you can imagine, you're at an intersection off-peak hours, having to wait for waiting for the walk button to come, or the walk signal, or the PED countdown timer to come up and allow you to walk. Whereas if it's clear, you go. So I think the other thing I'm going to throw out is I'll throw out some numbers at you as far as looking at traffic volumes. A typical single-lane roundabout can handle upwards of 20,000 vehicles a day. Multi-lane roundabouts, again, it depends. We've got 2 lanes, 3 lanes, a combination of both. You can handle upwards of 40 to 50,000 vehicles a day. So there's a myth out there that roundabouts can't handle the traffic operationally. But again, I think that is just that. It is a myth. The one in the town I live in, Eagle, Colorado, it's on a U.S. highway, and it handles over 20,000. It's a single-lane roundabout. It's actually just converted to a hybrid single multi-lane. Handles over 20,000 vehicles a day. So the sky's the limit as far as being flexible and roundabouts being very diverse in the applications of a roundabout. When you think of safety, you think of operations, you think of all modes, peds, bikes, and traffic.
Okay. We have time for a couple more questions. What do active yield and passive yield at roundabouts mean?
Okay. So active yield would be someone, and I guess maybe I don't want to interpret the question wrong. If the panelist is, or excuse me, if the person is asking about vehicles or asking about pedestrians in their behavior. So maybe could we ask that person to resubmit, or Fred, and maybe you can interpret different than I can. But if you're talking about the vehicles, a vehicle that's actively yielding would yield prior to the crosswalk. And again, the passive yield, I would need a little bit of clarification. I would ask that person to, if they could clarify exactly what they're talking about there, that would be helpful for me.
Okay. Well, what we'll do is see if we can get that question resubmitted, and we'll compose it to the website after the presentation. All right. And I'm going to take one more question. All right. Are there any known issues with placing a multi-lane roundabout at an intersection where both roadways have a single lane in each direction?
No. If single lane, and maybe they're talking one way. I'm not sure, again, on that question. But if you're talking vehicles traveling in 2 directions, 2 lanes, one in each direction, that's not an issue. If you're talking about a one-way street, that's definitely not an issue either. And for example, there's roundabouts that are constructed at ramp terminals, at interchanges, and so obviously if you think of the off-ramp and the on-ramp, at an interchange, you have one direction headed into the roundabout, and you might have one direction headed out of the roundabout, and then the other 2 approaches might be bidirectional. People or vehicles traveling in both directions. So again, it changes the layout, it changes your design a little bit, but the application of roundabouts with one-way roadways, if you will, is definitely an option, and definitely a good option in a lot of cases. So there are, again, it's not a limiting factor by any means if you were to have a one-way roadway headed into or out of a roundabout. And I hope I interpreted that question okay.
Okay. Well, I do want to thank you, Fred and Hillary, for your presentation today. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for discussion. If we did not get to your question today, we will be addressing all of the submitted questions and posting them to the webinar page on our website. Once again, a recording and transcript of today's program, as well as a view of the PDF of the slides, will be available in about a week at walkinginfo.org webinars. We will also be sending out an email with a link to download the printable certificate for professional development hours also. That email should come in about 1 to 2 days. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar has ended. Again, we very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Thank you again for our speakers, Fred and Hillary, for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for attending today's PBIC and Federal Highway Administration Designing for Pedestrian Safety webinar. Thank you and have a great day.